3 nights after Marisol and I hauled an injured giant out of the Black Thor slide, Prayer Ridge sent our own evening hymn back down through the firs. The singing was rough and low, not church clean, not any bird call I had heard in 71 years, but it carried the same turns we had sung by our wood stove since our boy Eli went under in the Cispus and did not come home. What came after never gave us reasons, only company, and I learned to keep the account close because some truths do not survive being handled loud. That evening started as plain as any other, with wet wood smoke and the smell of mud still rising from the lower pasture. I split kindling at the block while Marisol rinsed mason jars at the sink, and Scout lay under the bench with his muzzle on his paws, eyes open, ears shifting every time the north wall ticked in the cooling air. My shoulders still ached from shoveling at the washout. My hands burned where the handle of the Pulaski had raised blisters through old callus. By then the Black Thor had begun to break. Rain still fell in thin bands, but the hard push of storm water had eased off. The ruts in the track held standing brown water, and the ditch by the gate still carried a quick current, but the deep roar we had heard for 2 nights had settled back into creek sound. I checked the barn before dark. I did it slow. I checked the line of the stovepipe, the bucket by the door, the blankets folded over the rail. I did not look at the far stall first. I looked at everything else. Marisol came in with a lantern and set it on the nail by the tack shelf. She wore Eli's old wool overshirt over her dress, sleeves rolled twice. She kept doing that for years without talking about it, and I kept noticing, without saying so. She knelt beside Scout and put her hand flat on his neck. He did not wag. He leaned into her and watched the open barn door where twilight was settling in thin blue layers over the field. "Bandage is dry," she said. I nodded and stepped to the stall. The young one stood with weight off its right leg, fur still matted in places where we had washed grit and packed salve. It was taller than Marisol by a head, even hunched, broad through the chest, but lean from strain. Its breathing had slowed since dawn. I could hear each pull and release. Not panicked now. Measured. In the corner, we had set a bucket of water and a shallow pan with sliced apple and oats mashed with warm milk. Most of it was gone. From beyond lamplight, out past the fence and cottonwoods, a low tone came once, then stopped. Scout's ears went up. He did not bark. I stayed where I was and let my hand rest on the stall rail. The young one turned its head toward the sound, then back toward me. Its eyes held on mine for 1 long second. Dark, steady, alert. Not pleading, not trusting all the way either. The kind of look a hurt animal gives when pain and caution are still sharing the same body. I stepped back and lowered my gaze first. "Same one," Marisol said behind me, voice quiet. "Same one," I answered. We did not go out to the tree line. We had already learned enough to leave distance where distance was asked for. I shut the stall latch, checked it twice by habit, and we walked back to the cabin, with Scout between us. The mud sucked at our boots in the low spots. Up by the porch steps, the rain had eased to mist. I knocked my soles clean on the edgeboard and hung my jacket by the stove. Our evenings had followed one shape for 20 years. Coffee after supper if we had beans, dishes, a quick sweep, then hymn at dusk. Not every verse, not performance, just 1 or 2 lines held steady together before full dark. We started that winter after Eli died because the house was too quiet to bear any other way. We kept it because we did not know how to stop and still face each other at that hour. That night, Marisol set 2 chairs on the porch instead of by the fire. The boards were damp. The porch roof dripped in a slow pattern near the corner post. Across the drainage, Prayer Ridge stood dark and soaked, cedar and fir stacked in shadow bands up toward the old slide scar. Mist moved along its face in strips that caught what little light remained. Marisol wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and sat. I stood beside the rail, hand on the post, then sat too. Scout took his place near the top step and looked north. "You start," she said. I did. Soft, not full voice. The first line came rough in my throat from cold and tired lungs. Marisol joined on the second line, finding the harmony she always carried below me. We had sung that same hymn so many times that the shape of it lived in my ribs. I did not think through words anymore. I followed the old path of it and let breath do its work. The ridge answered on the third line. It came distant, low and layered, as if one chest started and another picked up half a beat later. The pitch drifted at the edges. Some notes were breath more than tone. But the contour matched ours. Rise, hold, drop, then that small lift at the end that Eli used to tease us for stretching too long. The call did not come from the cabin side or the creek side. It came from high on Prayer Ridge, where the trees thinned near the basalt shelf. I stopped singing mid-word. Marisol did not. She carried the line alone, steady as a board laid true, eyes fixed on the dark slope. When she finished, silence settled for a count of several breaths. Then the ridge gave back that final turn again, softer, farther upslope, like whoever made it had stepped behind timber. Marisol kept her hands folded in her lap. "You heard it," she said. "I heard it," she nodded once. "Same shape?" "Same shape." Scout stood and faced the ridge, body straight, tail level. A low sound moved in his throat. Not warning, not comfort either. Something between. The mist thickened around the fence posts. From the kitchen window, firelight fell in a narrow block onto the porch boards and stopped at our boots. I listened for coyotes. None. Listened for owl. None. The drainage carried water sound and little else. Then, faint and stretched by distance, that low hymn contour came one more time, this time with a break in the middle where a breath caught hard. I closed my eyes and saw Eli at 16, standing by this same rail with wet hair and river grit on his jeans, laughing because I held notes too long, like my mother did. He had my shoulders and Marisol's patience. He had learned the cedar braid from my mother in one afternoon and made a cleaner twist than I could at his age. When the river took him, it took our easy talk first. The rest of our life stayed, but thinner. Marisol reached over and put 2 fingers on my wrist. She did that when she wanted me present, not gone back. Her hand was cold from the air. I turned mine and held it. "We sing again tomorrow," she said. I nodded. "Same time?" "Yes." We sat until full dark closed down the ridgeline and turned the snag tops to flat black shapes. No more calls came. Scout settled back on the boards and laid his chin between his paws, still watching north through half-lidded eyes. Inside, the stove needed feeding. My knees had gone stiff in the damp. I stood, then offered Marisol my hand, and she took it as if we were stepping down church stairs, careful and practiced. At the door I looked back once. Prayer Ridge was only shadow then, with a strip of fog hanging low where the slide had run. Nothing moved that I could see. No eyeshine, no shape. Just timber and night, and the kind of quiet that made room for memory without crushing your chest. Inside, I wrote one line in the notebook I kept by the flour tin. Date, weather easing. 3rd night after rescue. Ridge returned hymn contour during dusk verse. I printed neat the way I did on millwright reports because if I was going to carry a thing this strange, I wanted the record plain and honest. Marisol read over my shoulder and touched the page with one fingertip. "Do not tell town," she said. "I will not." She put the notebook back by the tin and banked the stove for the night. We did not discuss what it meant. Meaning was too heavy to force. We had heard what we heard. That was enough for one evening. We took our separate chairs by the same fire as we had for years, and for the first time in a long while the space between those chairs did not feel empty. The stove popped once and settled to a low orange bed. Marisol sat angled toward the heat, with Eli's overshirt bunched at her elbows, and I watched her hands work the hem without her looking down, thumb rubbing that frayed seam the way she had done since the year we folded his clothes into cedar chests and could not bring ourselves to close the lids. Scout sighed in his sleep by the door. Outside, a drop fell from the porch roof at a steady count and tapped the same board each time. I set 2 more splits on the coals. The room smelled of wet wool and fir pitch. Our cups sat empty on the table. I could have spoken. I could have said the ridge sound had carried the 3rd note flat, that whoever answered had a damaged breath, that the line broke in the same place where the adult had paused in the timber while we worked the slide. I said none of it. Marisol did not ask for the words, and I did not press them into the room. After a while she stood, crossed to the shelf, and took down Eli's old enamel bowl with the chipped blue rim. She rinsed it and filled it with oats for morning, though there were only 2 of us to eat. She caught me looking and set it by the stove anyway. "Leave it," she said. "I will." We banked the fire and moved through our usual path to bed. She took the left side. I took the right. The mattress dipped in the middle where years had worn one hollow between us. Rain thinned to a soft hiss on the roof tin. I lay awake listening for another call from Prayer Ridge and heard only creek water and the old beams shifting as they cooled. Sometime near midnight, Scout stood once, padded to the north wall, and stood there without a sound. He came back only when Marisol spoke his name in a whisper. At first light, I rose to start coffee. The sky over the drainage was clear in narrow bands, clouds still caught on higher timber. The thaw mud had skinned over in the night, dark and slick where boots had churned it. I poured water from the barrel, fed the stove, and stepped out to split kindling before breakfast. My shoulders complained at the first swing, then loosened by the 5th. Each round broke clean. The crack of steel on fur rolled down the field and came back from the ridge half a second late. Marisol came out with 2 mugs and set mine on the chopping block. Steam lifted between us. She did not ask if I had slept. I did not ask if she had dreamed. We drank, watching Scout circle the yard line by line, nose low, tail straight. "Fence first," she said. I nodded. "North stretch after." We moved through chores as if we were back in any other spring. I hauled a post driver to the lower pasture and reset 2 leaning cedar posts where the thaw had softened soil around the base. Marisol checked the smokehouse roof patch we had laid in March and pushed a tarp tighter over the seam. By mid-morning, sun reached the barn door and drew a damp mineral smell from the packed ground. In the far stall, the young one stood more square than the day before, weight still cautious on that right leg, but better balanced. The bandage held. The cloth under its shoulder was dry. I set a pan of warm mash and stepped back. It watched my hands, then lowered its head and ate in slow pulls. I could hear teeth scrape enamel. Its fur along the ribs had dried in rough ridges, still clumped where mud had been hardest to wash out. When it finished, it drank from the bucket and lifted its face toward the open barn door, listening to something beyond my hearing. From the tree line came one short tone. I turned my head, but kept my feet planted. The young one's shoulders tightened, then eased. Scout appeared at my knee, silent, ears forward. He did not bare teeth. He did not retreat. He stood as if waiting for me to choose. I closed the stall and left the door open to light. At the threshold, I found two objects placed side by side on the board, clean despite mud all around, a twist of peeled cedar and a strip of horsehair braided into it, tight and even. Not a random tangle, patterned, left where my boot would find it. Marisol came up behind me. Her breath caught once, shallow and quick. "That braid," she said. I picked it up gently. "Yes." She touched one finger to the weave and turned away before her face settled. Eli had learned that same 2/1 twist from my mother when he was 11. He used to leave short braids on the table for no reason, proud of the neatness, pretending not to watch whether we noticed. After he died, we found one in the pocket of his rain jacket and kept it in the Bible by the stove. Morning followed morning, and our days kept that same practical rhythm, but each task carried a quiet edge. I sharpened chain on the saw and caught myself pausing between strokes to listen north. I mended a gate hinge and looked up at every raven call. Marisol kneaded bread at noon and set 3 apples on the windowsill instead of 2. At dusk we took our chairs to the porch and sang one verse. Some nights the ridge answered, some nights it did not. On nights it stayed quiet. Scout watched the timber anyway. Our grief did not leave. It changed shape. Eli's name began to sit in the room again without splitting the air. Marisol started saying it out loud when she handed me tools. Eli liked this one better. "Eli never tied this knot right," I answered with small facts of my own. "He could outcast me by 14. He hated parsnips and ate them anyway." We did not force long talk. We let each mention stand where it landed. One evening, while I scraped mud from my boots at the step, Marisol set Eli's bowl on the porch rail by habit and left it there through song. She did not comment. When we came in, the bowl was still in place. Untouched rain beaded along the blue rim. She took it inside, dried it, and put it back on the shelf with both hands. At dawn, the ground shifted in small ways that did not fit our routines. I found broad prints by the spring seep, deeper than any boot could press, 5 clear toes in each, heels sunk hard where weight had settled on wet ground. The track line crossed Elk Sign without following it and climbed toward the old skid road instead of open meadow. I set my hand beside one print and felt the cold water bead up under my palm. Scout stood back from the edge and whined once through his nose. At the woodpile that afternoon, peeled cedar strips lay in a neat stack against the rounds I had split at sunrise. No tooth marks, no claw rips. Each strip was pulled long and clean, as if someone had worked slowly with both hands, and then set the pieces where I would see them. I brought one inside and leaned it near the stove. Marisol glanced at it and kept slicing onions. "From the north side?" she asked. "By the pile?" She nodded. "Leave it there." By the next noon, 2 apples vanished from the porch crate. The crate lid had been closed. No splintering, no overturned boards, no pecking marks. The 3 remaining apples sat in a row, stems all turned the same way. I checked under the porch for raccoon sign and found nothing but old leaves and dry dirt. At supper, Marisol carried out 4 sliced apples on a tin plate and set them on the stump at the tree line. She stood there a full minute with empty hands in plain sight, then returned without looking over her shoulder. By morning, the plate was clean. At its center lay 2 crossed sticks and 1 grey feather pinned beneath the crossing point. Not dropped, placed. I crouched and studied the arrangement before I touched anything. The sticks were alder, both snapped to equal length, bark rubbed off at the same section where they crossed. The feather was from a jay, narrow and marked with 1 white bar near the tip. I lifted it and turned it in the light. Dry. No mud. No blood. Scout sniffed the stump and sat down beside it, calm. I carried the feather to the porch table. Marisol set a jar beside it without speaking and dropped the lid loosely so the vane would not bend. We did not call anyone. No ranger, no deputy, no neighbour from downriver. Some things asked for witness, not announcement. That evening, just as we started the second line of the hymn, a low contour came from Prayer Ridge, a little higher than the calls before. The next evening it came again, and this time 2 voices overlapped by half a breath. On the third evening, Scout gave a low growl that faded before the final note, and his back eased down as if the sound itself had told him to rest. Weather kept changing around those days. Warm sun in the morning, cold drip wind by dusk, fog settling in the draw while upper trees stayed clear. The cold came early each evening, and the woods would not settle with it. Deer stopped bedding near the lower pasture. Their beds went empty and flattened by rain. Ravens gathered on one dead snag above the creek crossing and faced north as if waiting for a signal I could not read. After lunch the next day, I walked the fence and found the top wire lifted clean from 2 staples along the north line, not torn, just raised and set back down. Under that gap, the grass lay bent in one direction, then rose untouched on the other side. I reset the wire, hammered new staples, and marked the post with chalk. By dawn, the wire was lifted again. Same 2 points, same careful lay. That evening, I set sliced venison and apples on the stump with a small jar of salve we had used on the young one's abrasions. I stepped back to the porch and sat where I could see the stump through open rails. Marisol took the chair beside me. Scout lay between us with his head on his paws, eyes open. Night came in blue layers over Prayer Ridge. We waited through one verse and half of another. Nothing moved at the stump. Then, far up the slope beyond the basalt shelf, a single tone sounded, rough and low, and held longer than before, carrying the exact rise and fall of the hymn, Turn Eli used to stretch until we laughed and told him to breathe. Marisol's hand found mine on the arm of the chair and stayed there while the ridge finished the line. The last note from the ridge thinned into the drip of water off the porch roof. I kept my hand under Marisol's and listened for the next breath of it. Scout lifted his head from the boards and turned toward the stump at the tree line where I had set the venison and apples. His ears stood hard forward. He did not growl. The mist moved low across the pasture and opened a narrow gap between 2 alder trunks. In that gap, I saw a shape where there should have been open dark. It was only shoulder and part of a head at first, half covered by vine maple, too high and wide to be a deer, too still to be bear. I stopped breathing and felt the muscles in my back lock the way they used to lock, when a chain under load started to sing in the mill, and one wrong move could take a hand. Marisol's fingers tightened on mine. "North edge," she said, no louder than dry leaves. "I see him," I answered. The figure did not step out fully. It held at the margin, one arm bent across its chest, the other hanging low. Rain-dark fur lay flat in long strands over the shoulder. I could make out a brow ridge and the line of the nose when it turned slightly toward us. Its face stayed in shadow, but the posture was plain. Not crouched to spring, not swaying in threat. It stood like a sentry at a gate, waiting to see what we would do. I had the old pull to stand up and make myself larger. I felt it in my knees and hands. I stayed seated. Marisol stayed seated. Scout shifted his front paws under him, ready, then set his chest down again without taking his eyes off the figure. No one on the porch spoke. No one at the trees made a sound. The hymn contour came once more from higher on Prayer Ridge, farther back from the tree line, and the figure near the alder turned its head toward that call, the way a man turns when his name is spoken from another room. It looked back at us one last time. Even at that distance, I had the clear sense of attention, direct and measuring. Then it stepped backward into the vine maple. One smooth motion, and the dark took it whole. I stayed frozen a long while after it was gone. My palms were wet. My jaw ached from holding tight. I realized I had not blinked and forced my eyes closed once, slow, then opened them to the same wet field and the same black tree line. Marisol let out a breath through her nose. "He chose distance," she said. "Yes." "Not fear." "No." She nodded once, and that was all. We waited until the fire in the stove inside had dropped low enough to remind us we were old, and the damp could settle too deep in joints if we sat stubborn. I rose first and helped her up by the hand. Scout stood between us and looked once more toward the alders, then followed us in. At the door, I turned and marked where the figure had stood by lining the spot with the corner post and the split snag behind it. Habit from years of setting levels and plumb lines. If I saw him there again, I wanted to know if it was exact. Inside, Marisol fed 2 short splits to the coals and set the kettle on. I took the lantern and went back out alone to the stump. The plate was still there. The apples and venison were gone. The jar of salve sat near the centre with mud smudged along the glass, and the lid loosened half a turn, not dropped, not forced. Beside it lay a peeled cedar strip folded twice and tucked under the jar base as if to keep it from tipping. I carried all 3 items in and set them on the table under the lamp. Marisol wiped the jar with a damp cloth and held it to the light. A shallow line of salve was gone from the top, scooped with fingers, not spilled. "Used," she said. "Looks that way." She turned the cedar strip in both hands. One end had been rubbed smooth where thumb and forefinger would work it. She set it down gently and reached for Eli's bowl on the shelf. She held the bowl at her chest a second, then placed it next to the jar and cedar and looked at me. "Tomorrow," she said. I knew what she meant. Tomorrow. We slept in short stretches that night. Twice I woke to Scout standing at the north wall. Twice he settled when I spoke his name. Sometime near dawn, rain stopped fully. The silence after a week of weather felt wide and almost bright, even in darkness. At first light, I walked out with the notebook, the way I would have walked a line after a heavy shift and checked every bolt in sequence. I found one clear print near the stump, half in mud and half on fir needles, toes spread where weight had settled before a step back. Uphill. I measured with my handspan and wrote it down. I noted the jar lid loosened, salve reduced, cedar strip present. No claw marks, no signs of digging, deliberate placement of all objects. When I came back to the porch, Marisol was already there in Eli's overshirt, holding 2 mugs. She handed me one and followed my gaze to the tree line. "You will leave food again," she said. "Yes." Same time. "Yes." She sat on the top step with her mug between both palms. "Do not walk in." "I will not." Her voice stayed level, but she looked at my boots when she said it, and I understood the memory beneath the words. Riverbanks, mudslide edges, all the places where one more step had taken people from us. By mid-morning, the sky cleared in strips over the ridge. I repaired the lifted fence wire on the north line and replaced both staples with longer ones. Marisol washed the barn cloths we had used on the young one and hung them where the sun could catch the damp out. Scout patrolled the same arc from porch to barn, to spring seep and back. Steady pace, no hurry. His calm carried into my shoulders like a hand pressing down. That afternoon I prepared the offering with the same care I used for a brace cut. 4 apple halves, 2 strips of venison, 1 heel of cornbread, and the enamel bowl Marisol had set aside. I nearly reached for salt and stopped, too sharp for a wound. I left it plain. The next evening came clear and cold, with a pale strip of sky still visible above Prayer Ridge at hymn time. I carried the bowl to the stump before dusk and set it dead center. I unscrewed the salve jar and left it beside the food with the lid resting loosely on top. Then I stepped backward, palms open, and returned to the porch without turning my back. Marisol joined me with her shawl wrapped tight. Scout lay down between our chairs but kept his head up. The yard held that clean, after-rain smell of fir bark and wet soil cooling fast. Up on the ridge, ravens traded places on the dead snag and then settled facing west. We waited through the first line of the hymn without singing it. I listened to my own breathing and to Marisol's, felt each count slow. Then she started softly, just above a whisper, and I came in beneath her on the second phrase. Halfway through, a branch clicked once at the tree line. I did not look right away. I kept the line steady to the end, then let the last note fall naturally and turned my head. The figure stood farther out than the night before, just beyond the stump, full torso visible now between two cedars, shoulders broad, chest deep, arms long enough that the hands hung near mid-thigh. The fur along one side looked rough and short in patches, old scars or rubbed spots where bark had taken hair off over years. He faced us directly. Scout gave one low rumble that faded as soon as it started. His ears remained forward. His body did not rise. Marisol spoke without moving her gaze. "We stay seated." "Yes." The figure looked from us to the stump, then back. He took one step in, slow enough to show intent, not stealth. He crouched near the bowl, head angled as if smelling each item in order. He touched the salve jar first, turned it, and set it down upright. Then he lifted the bowl with both hands, brought it close, and paused. In that pause, he looked towards the barn. From the porch, I could see the thin seam of lantern light at the barn door, where we had left it cracked for air. The young one was still in the north stall, standing more square than before, eating and drinking on his own, but keeping weight careful on the right leg. We had checked him before dusk, changed the wrap, and watched him settle. Seeing this adult angle his head toward that same door, I understood he was not looking by chance. He was tracking, monitoring, making sure the injured one remained where he expected and still under care. He lowered the bowl and selected 2 apple halves. He did not take all of it. He backed to the tree line and waited, watching. Another shape moved high behind him, barely more than a shift in shadow, then held still. I set my hands on the chair arms to keep them from shaking. "Take the rest," I said, voice low and plain, the way I would speak to a skittish horse. He did not retreat at the sound. He stood. He listened. Marisol added one line, soft as breath. "It is all right." He dipped his head once. Not a nod a man would make, but close enough that my chest tightened at the gesture. He stepped in again, took the venison and cornbread, and left the bowl on the stump. Then he reached to the ground by his right foot, picked up something I had not seen, and placed it carefully in the empty space where the food had been. He withdrew 3 paces and stopped in the open. Moonlight had not risen yet, but the sky held enough grey that I could see his eyes catch one dull reflection. Not bright like deer, dark and steady. He stayed there for a count of several breaths while we stayed where we were, no sudden movement from either side. Then he turned uphill, crossed behind the cedars, and moved through brush with far less sound than an animal that size should make. The second shadow followed. Within moments there was only tree line and dusk. We waited until full dark before going to the stump. Scout went first and sniffed the bowl, then the new object, and sat down as if to guard both. I lifted what had been left. It was a short braid of cedar bark and horsehair, tighter than any I could make now with old fingers, and wrapped around its center was a narrow strip of blue thread, faded almost grey. Marisol touched the thread and closed her eyes. "From Eli's old saddle blanket," she said. I looked at her, then back at the braid. The blanket had been hanging in the tack room for years, edges frayed, thread pulling loose along one corner where Eli used to grip it and swing up. Now that same corner looked cleaner, as if one worn strip had been removed with care instead of tearing away. I set the braid in her palm. She held it there a long moment, then placed it back in mine and nodded toward the house. "Jar by the feather," she said. Inside, I put the braid in the same glass jar as the jay feather and set both on the shelf above the flour tin where damp and mice could not reach. I wrote the date and every detail in the notebook, including the blue thread and where we believed it came from. Marisol read my notes, then added one line in her steady script beneath mine: "Returned with care." That night, as the stove settled and the room went quiet around us, we did not take separate chairs by habit. Marisol pulled hers close enough that our knees nearly touched. We sat that way without talking, listening to the north wall and the soft breathing of Scout at our boots. Carrying the plain fact that trust had begun, and had begun in both directions. Trust had begun, and it was tested before the coals burned down. Scout rose from the hearth with no warning, ears high, body stiff, and crossed to the door in 3 quick steps. He did not bark. He gave one low sound from deep in his chest, and looked back at me once, then at the latch. Marisol was already standing. She took the lantern from the nail and held it up between us. Wind pressed a thin draught under the sill. The north wall gave a soft knock, not from beams cooling now, but from something outside moving against the boards. "Barn," she said. I nodded and reached for my jacket. Rope and the big kettle. She did not ask why. She set the lantern in my hand and went for the kettle. Outside, night had thickened into wet black, with low cloud hiding the ridgeline. The yard mud held a skin of cold that broke under our boots. Scout ran ahead, stopped halfway to the barn, and stood angled toward the tree line. I lifted the lantern and caught movement near the stump. Broad shoulders, long arms held close. The adult male stood half in shadow, chest rising fast, then falling, then rising again. He gave a short, rough tone. Another, not the dusk hymn. These were clipped and urgent, pushed out on tight breath. He turned toward the barn door and struck the post once with the side of his hand. Not hard enough to break it, hard enough to call us. Marisol came beside me with the kettle and a bundle of cloth over her arm. "He is asking." "Yes." Inside the barn, the warmth we had banked was gone. The barrel stove was dark, only a line of ash glow at the grate. A sharp mineral smell came from the far stall, mixed with wet fur and sour breath. The young one lay on its side in churned straw, right leg twisted under and forward, bandage half unravelled, cloth dark where fresh seep had soaked through. Its breathing came short and fast. When I stepped closer, I could hear a small rattle at the end of each pull. I knelt at the rail and put my hand on its shoulder fur. Heat, too much heat. The skin under the mat was hot and dry while the hands and feet felt cold. Shock had started to take hold and the leg had gone hard with swelling above the old splint. Marisol set the kettle down and touched the neck under the jawline. Fever. I checked the stall floor. Water had begun to creep in from the back corner where Thor runoff found a low seam under the plank. Not deep yet, but rising. If the young one stayed down on wet straw with that body heat running high, it would lose strength fast and fail before morning. From the doorway, the adult gave that short tone again. Then another lower one, holding the second note until his breath broke. I looked at Marisol. We both knew the practical options. Call town and bring a veterinarian, and we would lose the animal to men with trucks and questions by dawn. Do nothing and hope, and we would hear that breathing stop before daylight. The choice was no longer theory. It was in front of us on cold straw, shaking. Right now, I said. We reset, rewrap, dry ground, and heat this stall. Marisol nodded once. I boil water, you rig lift. Scout moved to the stall opening and lay down facing outward, watching both the door and the young one. I crossed to the tack wall, took down the block and tackle I used for engine pulls, and carried it to the center beam. Old habit took over. Check beam, check hook, check chain. I ran a canvas sling under the young one's chest as gently as I could, keeping clear of the injured leg. It flinched once and bared teeth for a second, then closed its jaw and held still, eyes fixed on mine. Pain and control, both present. It is all right, Marisol said, low and even as she poured hot water into a basin. We are working. At the door, the adult lowered his head and stayed where he was. By the time the kettle steamed, rain had started again in fine needles on the tin roof. I took the chain weight and lifted just enough to bring pressure off the trapped leg. The young one groaned through closed mouth, a deep, rough sound that shook the stall rail. Marisol cut away the old cloth wraps with shears and set each strip aside in a clean pile and a dirty pile, same as she had done for Eli when he split his shin on shale at 12. The wound along the calf was not torn open deep, but the skin around it was swollen and hot, with mud grit still working out in thin streaks, where our first wash had missed pockets in the fur. We clean again, she said. Do it. She flushed with warm water and a pinch of salt, slow and steady, wiping outward with fresh cloth each pass. I kept the sling taut and watched the joint line. The lower leg sat off angle from where it should track, not broken through, but slipping when weight came on. We needed a straighter brace and tighter support, and we needed it before the fever climbed higher. The adult shifted at the door. I glanced up. He did not step in. He crouched and set something on the threshold with careful fingers, then drew back. When I got a clear look, I saw 3 peeled willow strips, long and supple, and a bundle of dry cedar bark, splint material and tinder, both better than what we had at hand in the wet. Marisol saw it too. She did not speak. She reached, took the willow, and laid it beside the basin. The crux of that hour was simple and hard. If we forced the leg fast, we could do damage that would never mend. If we moved too slowly, shock and cold would take him first. I braced one hand above the hock and one below, waited through 2 breaths, then drew the lower leg into line by degrees, while Marisol supported the thigh and watched the face for panic. The young one shook from shoulder to foot. One hand closed on the rail and split a splinter from the top board, but it did not strike. It held still for us. I felt the joint settle with a dull shift under skin. Not a snap, just a heavy click into better alignment. Now, Marisol said. I held position while she laid willow strips along both sides, padded the gaps with folded cloth, then bound the brace with torn sheet bands and horse wrap, tight enough to support, loose enough for blood flow. She tucked the end under, pressed once, and looked to me. Check. I set the foot down to straw and watched for tremor. Present, but less. Toes warm enough, colour returning along the nail beds. Water at the back of the stall had crept another inch by then. I dropped the sling, shoved straw bales against the seam, and cut a shallow trench with a flat shovel to divert runoff towards the alley drain. Mud and cold water rushed into the cut and away from the stall floor. Scout stood and tracked the water line until it moved clear, then lay down again. Marisol had the stove going by then, cedar bark catching quick under split fur. Heat began to push into the space, first at ankle level, then rising. She stripped wet fur along the wound edge with a towel and worked salve deep where the skin was abraded. The smell of pine resin and rendered fat filled the stall and masked the sour edge of fever. The young one tried to rise too early, slipped, and dropped back hard enough to rattle the rail. "Wait," I said, palm on its shoulder. "Wait." It stared at me, breath pumping, then eased down a fraction. 3 days had passed since the mudslide, and now the second fight had started. I set up a second sling behind the hips so we could lift in 2 points. On my count, Marisol took the rear line, I took the front, and we raised him just high enough to get his feet under. He hung in the slings for a long second, head low, then found balance. The right leg touched and trembled but did not fold. We kept him there while Marisol slid dry bedding under and pulled wet straw out with a manure fork, quick and precise. No wasted motion. At the doorway, the adult gave one low tone, softer this time, and laid both hands flat on the dirt, as if grounding himself against the urge to come in. We walked the young one 2 steps forward and 1 back, then settled him in the driest corner near the stove's lee side. I rubbed down the arms and chest with rough towels to drive warmth back into the extremities. Marisol held a mug of warm water with a little molasses at the lips. He drank in short pulls, paused, then drank again. The fever broke its sharp peak near midnight. Sweat damped the fur at the neck. Breathing lengthened from rapid pulls to deeper cycles, with clean release at the end. The rattle eased. By 2 in the morning, rain had turned to mist, and the runoff line at the stall seam had stopped rising. I sat on an overturned bucket with my back to the post and watched the chest rise and fall. Marisol leaned against the tack wall, eyes closed but not sleeping, one hand still on the coil of clean cloth in her lap. Scout lay with his chin on the young one's forearm, calm and heavy. Outside, once every few minutes, we heard the adult shift weight in the mud and settle again. No one spoke for a long stretch. Tools clicked as they cooled. The stove gave a low draw through the pipe. The barn smelled of hot metal, wet wool, and cedar smoke. Near 3, the young one lifted his head and looked toward the door. The adult answered with a short hum, almost under his breath. The young one gave a weaker version back, then lowered his head and slept, still standing in the sling support. Marisol opened her eyes and looked at me across the dim light. "He stays till daylight," she said. "Yes. You hold first watch. I hold second." I shook my head. "We both hold." She gave me that look she used when she would not argue because she had already decided. She stood, came to my side, and tucked a folded blanket around my shoulders anyway. Then she checked the bandage one more time, fingertips light along the wrap, and nodded at the result. When grey finally reached the high cracks in the barn siding, the storm was gone. Cold remained, but clean and still. The adult was no longer at the threshold. He stood 10 yards out by the cottonwoods, full height in dawn haze, watching. I eased the front sling loose. The young one shifted weight, right leg held. I eased the rear sling. He stood on his own, swayed once, then steadied. Marisol set the enamel bowl near his feet. He drank half, lifted his head, and looked from her to me, then to the open door. "Not yet," I said, and touched the brace. "One more day." He did not bolt. He stood and accepted the touch. The adult took 1 step forward into clearer light. Scars crossed his chest in pale lines under dark, wet fur. He held my gaze without challenge. Then he looked to Marisol, to Scout, to the brace on the young one's leg, taking each fact in as if counting tools returned after a hard job. He dipped his head once. Marisol lifted her hand, palm open at waist height. "He is safe," she said. The adult stayed another breath, then turned uphill and moved into timber, silent by the fourth step. We heard one branch brush and then nothing. I checked the wrap, checked the warmth in the foot, checked the drain trench and stove draft, each in order because that was how I kept fear from running ahead of my hands. Everything held. When I finally sat back on the bucket, my legs started to shake from effort and cold and the long hold of concentration. Marisol sat beside me on the straw without minding the damp at her hem. Scout pressed against our knees. In the stall, the young one stood near the heat, eyes half-lidded, breathing steady, alive because we had chosen and then kept choosing through the night. I stayed seated a moment longer because my legs would not trust me yet. Then I pushed up with both hands on my knees and went to the stall rail again. The young one stood with its head low, steam lifting off its shoulders in the cold morning light that came through the cracks. Its right leg shook once, then held. Marisol rose beside me and checked the wrap with 2 fingers, light and practiced. "Still warm at the foot," she said. "Good." Scout pressed past us and sat in the doorway, eyes fixed on the cottonwoods. He gave one soft huff through his nose. The adult male stepped out from behind the nearest trunk and came forward 3 slow paces, not crossing the threshold, not backing off either. In full dawn he looked even larger than he had at night, broad through the chest, old scars pale against wet dark fur. One ear notched at the top like it had torn long ago and healed rough. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I kept my hands down where he could see them. The young one turned at the sound of the adult's breathing and shifted toward him. It put weight on the brace, tested it, then took a careful step. The adult answered with a low hum, almost the first line of the hymn, but shortened, as if he did not have enough breath to carry the full shape. Marisol lifted the enamel bowl and set it nearer the door. "Drink first," she said quietly, more to steady us than to command anything. The young one drank, then raised its head and looked from her to me. Its eyes were clear now, not glassed by fever. It took another step and came to the threshold. The adult moved in close enough that their shoulders touched. He put one hand on the young one's upper arm, fingers spread, and held there until the tremor in that leg settled. Then he looked directly at me. I had stood inside mills with belts whipping overhead and steel under strain, and I knew what raw force looked like. This was not that. His gaze was steady, focused, and deliberate. Not wild, not angry, not afraid. It carried the same attention I had seen in Marisol, when she set a splint, in my mother, when she taught Eli to braid cedar, in any person who understood cost and memory, both. I did not try to read beyond what was in front of me. I only met his eyes and stayed still. He released the young one and crouched near the threshold. His right hand went to the dirt, palm down. After a breath, he turned that hand and placed it palm up on the board between us. The gesture was simple and unmistakable. Not surrender, not threat. An offering of open skin. My throat tightened. I crouched to match his height and set my own hand, palm up, on the same board with a span of air between us. My fingers shook from cold and fatigue. He watched the tremor and did not move until it quieted. Then he reached, touched the base of my thumb with 2 fingertips, and held that contact for one measured breath. His skin was rough, warm, and dry. When he withdrew, he touched his chest once, then angled his hand toward Marisol. She had tears on her face and had not noticed them. She put her palm flat over her heart and nodded once. No one spoke. The young one leaned its shoulder into the adult and gave a low sound that rose at the end, close to the 3rd line we sang each dusk. Scout stood and took 2 steps forward, sniffed the air between them, then sat back down, calm. I reached to the peg beside the door and took Eli's old wool blanket, the one we kept in the barn for cold nights. I folded it twice and set it on the threshold near the adult's feet. He looked at it, then at me, then nudged it toward the young one with his knuckles. The young one gathered it awkwardly against its chest, favoring the braced leg. "Go slow," I said, voice low. "Short steps." It was a plain work sentence. It was all I had. They turned toward the north rise and started up the muddy track behind the barn. The adult kept his body on the downhill side, close enough to brace if the young one slipped. Twice they paused. Twice the adult hummed that short contour and waited for the young one's breath to settle before moving again. At the break in the cottonwoods, he stopped and looked back. Morning light caught his eyes one last time. He dipped his head, then followed the young one into timber. The woods took them in 3 steps. I stood at the doorway long after they were gone, listening to nothing but runoff in the ditch and the stove ticking as it cooled. Marisol came beside me and rested her shoulder against mine. Scout lay down in the straw where the young one had stood, circled once, and slept. By late afternoon, after we had cleaned the stall and burned the soiled wraps, I walked to the north line to check for sign. Their track was easy to follow at first, deep in Thor mud, then lighter on fir needles. At the old skid road crossing, where the ground rose and drained clean, the prints narrowed into one line as the young one leaned into the adult's support. I stopped there. I did not follow farther. When I returned, Marisol had set 2 chairs on the porch again and laid Eli's braid jar on the rail between them. The jay feather sat against the glass. The blue thread in the cedar twist caught a thin strip of sun and went dull again. "We sing as usual," she said. "Yes." At dusk, the sky over Prayer Ridge cleared to a pale steel band. We started the hymn with tired voices. On the second line, a low answer came from high timber, then another below it, then a third. Not close, not hidden either. Layered and uneven, breathing at different intervals but following the same turns. Marisol did not stop this time. Neither did I. The answer held through the final lift and faded with the light. Scout watched north, ears up, body loose. He did not growl. The next day passed in ordinary chores. I reset one fence post that had canted in the thaw. Marisol mended the cuff of Eli's overshirt by the window and kept glancing toward the tree line between stitches. Near noon I found fresh peeled cedar laid in 2 neat strips by the stump. I brought them in and leaned them by the stove. She looked once and nodded. On the second evening after they left the barn, rain moved in low from the west and wrapped the ridge in mist. We sang anyway. The answer came late. Just one voice at first, then 2 more with a pause between each phrase, as if they were listening for us before continuing. The sound was rougher in wet air and carried a chest-deep vibration that I felt through the porch boards. On the third evening, the sky broke clear after sunset, and that was when the larger consequence arrived. We had just finished the first line when Scout stood and faced Prayer Ridge, so hard his front paws spread on the boards. I followed his gaze to the basalt shelf where the trees thin before the slope drops. 5 figures stood there in clean silhouette, shoulder to shoulder, unmoving. One was the adult male. One was smaller and held a slight lean on the right side. No one advanced. A low call began at the left end of the line and moved across them, each voice entering half a breath after the one before, building the hymn contour we had carried for 20 years. It was not mimicry now. It was shared form. Their tones were coarse and deep and sometimes broke, but the structure held true, including the small lift at the line's end that Eli had always stretched. Marisol gripped the porch rail with both hands. She was crying again, silent, face turned towards the ridge. I kept singing under my breath through their line and into ours, and for the first time, since the river took our boy, the name of that hymn no longer felt like a weight I had to lift alone. It felt like a bridge laid from one side of grief to another, built plank by beings who owed us nothing and had chosen to answer anyway. When the final note faded, the 5 figures remained for one long breath. Then the adult raised his arm once, palm outward at chest height. The others turned. They moved along the ridgeline and disappeared among the firs without breaking the quiet. Night settled full after they were gone. No owl called. No coyote yipped. The drainage held only creek sound and the soft rattle of wind in dead grass. Marisol sat down slowly, wiped her face with both hands and looked at the jar on the rail. "They heard him with us," she said. I knew she meant Eli. "Yes," I said. We stayed out until the porch boards turned cold through our boots. Before going in, I carried the jar back to the shelf above the flour tin and set it beside the notebook. I opened to a clean page and wrote the date. Weather clear after rain. 5 on Prayer Ridge at dusk. Layered hymn response. Juvenile present with right leg lean. Marisol read it, then added beneath my line in her steady hand, "Witnessed together." In the days that followed, we kept to work and to song. At dawn, we split wood, checked wire, hauled water, fed Scout, and did what old bodies still could. At dusk, we carried 2 chairs to the porch and sang one verse toward the ridge. Some nights, one voice answered, some nights, several. On quiet nights, we sang anyway and let the silence stand as its own reply. The peace missing in our house did not return as it had been. Eli did not walk through the door. His boots did not sound on the porch. But the hour that had once hollowed us out began to hold something steady and shared. Grief stayed. So did company. One evening, after we finished the hymn and the ridge gave back a faint final turn through mist, Marisol reached across the space between our chairs and set her hand over mine, the same way she had on the night we first heard the answer. She did not look at me. She looked north. "Same time tomorrow," she said. "Yes," I told her. "Same time." The next evening, I set the 2 chairs out before the light went thin, one on each side of the porch rail post where Eli had carved his initials with a pocket knife and then tried to sand them out when he thought I would scold him. The marks were still there. Marisol carried the hymn book, though we had not needed it in years. Scout circled once and settled at the top step with his nose pointed north. Cold came early and clean. The ridge held a narrow band of sun at the top, while the drainage below us turned blue and damp. I could smell fir pitch from the split pile, and the last of the mud from the Black Thor, drying in cracked plates by the gate. "We sing full verse," Marisol said. "Yes." She opened the book anyway and set one finger on the line. We started together, rough at first, then steadier by the second phrase. On the third phrase, the answer came from Prayer Ridge, low and layered. One voice entered, a second followed, then a third, higher and shorter, likely the young one still working around that brace. Marisol did not look surprised anymore. She just sang through it and held the final lift. After the note faded, Scout stood and walked to the stump. I took the lantern and followed. On the stump sat the enamel bowl we had left in the barn 2 days earlier, washed by rain, turned upright, and centered on the cut rings as carefully as any dish set for supper. Inside lay 3 items: a peeled cedar strip, folded tight, 1 smooth black stone from the creek bend below our lower pasture, and a short braid of horsehair with no thread in it, plain and clean. Marisol touched the stone and looked toward the ridge. From Eli's Bend, she said. I know it. She lifted the horsehair braid and turned it once between finger and thumb. This one is new. I nodded. Not from our tack wall. We carried all three inside. I dried the bowl, set it back on the shelf, and put the braid and cedar strip in the jar with the jay feather and blue thread twist. The black stone I left on the windowsill above the sink where morning light could hit it. In the notebook, I recorded each item and where it was found. Marisol read over my shoulder and added in her even hand, returned after standing line of 5. 2 mornings later, under a pale sky and wind from the east, I walked the north fence and found the same 2 staples lifted again at shoulder height, wire raised and set down without kinking. This time the ground was drier and the trail through bent grass was plain. It ran from that fence gap to the stump and from the stump to the barn side, then back uphill. A route, not wandering. Marisol came up carrying fencing pliers. She looked at the lifted wire and then at me. Leave this span, she said. Do not set those 2. I tested the line with my hand. The rest held tight. Stock will not push here, she nodded. It is a gate. So I fixed every other loose point and left those 2 staples out on purpose. That evening a raven landed on the dead snag above the crossing, then a second and third, all facing the same north shoulder of Prayer Ridge where the figures had stood. They kept watch until dusk song, then flew before full dark. I had marked that raven behavior for weeks without understanding it. By then, I took it as a weather sign and a movement sign both. They gathered before visits and broke when the line was clear. By the 2nd week of October, frost held till noon in the shadows, and Marisol's cough, the one she had carried lightly for years, sat deeper in her chest at dawn. She still split apples for the stump. She still checked the wraps in the barn where no patient stood now, as if her hands remembered the work and wanted to keep it ready. One afternoon she stood at the shelf with the jar in both hands, looking at the feather, the blue thread, the 2 braids, and the cedar strips curled behind the glass. You keep writing, she said. I do. Even if I sleep through dusk, you sing. I set down the draw knife and faced her. You will not sleep through. She gave me a look that was gentle and level and finished the thought she had been carrying for days. If I do, you sing anyway. I did not answer right off. The stove ticked once. Scout shifted on his blanket. Then I said, I will. That night, rain moved in low, the kind that hangs in mist before it falls. We took the chairs out under the porch roof and sang 1 verse into wet air. No answer came on the first line, none on the second. On the last lift, just when I thought the ridge would stay quiet, 1 deep tone rose from high timber and held until breath gave out. It was enough to make Scout lower his head and settle. 3 days passed before clear sky returned. On the 4th night, Marisol went to bed early with Eli's overshirt folded under her pillow for warmth. She said her chest felt tight from damp and asked me to bank the stove high. I did. I checked doors, checked the north wall, and wrote the weather line in the notebook. Rain ended, pressure rising, ravens absent at dusk, 1 distant response. When I came to bed, she was asleep on her side facing the window, breath shallow but even. I lay down and listened to her, and to creek water in the dark until I slept too. I woke before dawn to stillness that was wrong. No roof drip, no bed rustle, no shift of breath beside me. I put my hand on her shoulder, warm, but not waking. I said her name once, then again. Scout stood in the doorway and watched, ears down, not moving. By first light, I had the doctor from town up the track. He checked her pulse, her pupils, her chest, then packed his stethoscope in a slow, careful way and put 1 hand on my arm. In sleep, he said. No struggle. I nodded. I signed what needed signing at the kitchen table with Millwright print block letters that did not look like mine. He asked if I wanted the pastor called. I said yes for Marisol's sister, and no details beyond that. He looked at the notebook by the flour tin, at the jar on the shelf, and then back to me. He never asked about either. The loaded look he gave me at the door, as if there was a question he would not push, stayed a look and never became words. After he left, I fed Scout because the body keeps needing what it needs. I split kindling because the stove had to hold. I sat at the table with Marisol's hymn book open to our page and waited for dusk like a man waits for a verdict already written. At sunset, I carried one chair to the porch, then went back and brought the second and set it in her usual place. Empty, shawl folded over the back. The ridge was washed in thin mist, fir tops dark against a pale strip of sky. My hands shook when I opened the hymn book, so I closed it again and sang from memory. My voice cracked on the first line and nearly failed on the second. On the third line, Prayer Ridge answered. Not loud, not close. 3 low voices in a layered contour, entering half a breath apart, holding the same turn we had held together for 20 years. On the final lift, a 4th voice joined, rougher and shorter, then dropped out like a younger chest still learning where to place air. I stood with one hand on the empty chair back until the notes faded into fog. Scout came and leaned against my leg, steady weight, no sound. The next morning I moved the collected items with care. I left the Black Creek stone on the sink sill. I set the jar and notebook in a cedar box with a tight lid and slid it under the bed where mice and damp would not ruin paper or feather. I kept one braid out, the plain horsehair one returned in the enamel bowl, and hung it by the north window. The salve jar, nearly empty, I washed and put back on the shelf for work use. Nothing was abandoned. Nothing was thrown away. That evening, and the evening after, I set 2 chairs out. I sang one verse. Sometimes the ridge answered full. Sometimes only one tone came. On dry nights with no mist, silence held and I let it hold. On weather change nights, when ravens gathered on that same dead snag before dusk, and Scout lifted his head toward Prayer Ridge before I heard anything, the harmony returned like distant, timbered breath. Years settled over the place in ordinary layers of repairs, snowmelt, fence posts, and wood smoke. Scout slowed and slept longer by the stove, but at hymn time he still took his place at the step when his legs allowed it. I did not tell town what the ridge carried back. The doctor never asked again. Marisol's sister took the dishes she wanted and left Eli's bowl, the overshirt, and both porch chairs where they had always been. One evening in late November, mist sat low in the firs, and the first hard skim of ice edged the water trough. I stepped onto the porch with the hymn book under my arm and the plain horsehair braid in my pocket, set one chair for me and one for her, and sang into the grey. Halfway through the verse, 5 low voices rose from Prayer Ridge in the same old contour, rough and true and patient, and I stood there alone in the cold, with my hand on Marisol's empty chair, listening until the last note thinned into creak sound, carrying grief and company together as one enduring thing.